March 17, 1943, Rhineland, Western Germany. The morning breaks cold and gray over the village of Krefeld, where smoke still rises from yesterday's bombing raid. In a modest farmhouse at the edge of wheat fields turned black by fire, a woman named Margaret Hoffman kneels beside a hidden cellar door, her hands trembling not from cold but from the weight of a choice made 3 days prior. She is 42 years old, a widow. Her husband lost to the Eastern Front 2 winters ago. She knows the rules. She knows the consequences. Yet when she found the young British pilot bleeding in her barn, his parachute tangled in the rafters like a ghost's surrender, she did not see an enemy. She saw a boy far from home, his lips cracked from thirst, his eyes filled with the same fear she'd seen in her own son's face before he left for Stalingrad. She gave him water, then bread, then sanctuary. Now 3 days later, she hears the sound that stops every German heart in 1943, the sharp mechanical rhythm of SS boots on cobblestone, growing closer, accompanied by the low growl of truck engines and voices that do not ask. They command. The village of Krefeld exists in that peculiar state of wartime suspension, where daily life continues beneath a canopy of dread. The bakery still opens at dawn. Children still walk to school, though half their teachers are gone. Women still gather at the market square, trading rumors and ration cards with equal currency. But everyone understands the unspoken rules of survival in the Third Reich's 6th year of war. You report suspicious activity. You denounce the weak. You do not shelter the enemy no matter how human their suffering appears. Margaret Hoffman had been a schoolteacher before the war, a woman known for her kindness and her library of banned books hidden behind loose floorboards. Her husband Johann had been a postal worker and amateur violinist, a man who loved Brahms and despised parades. They had raised their son, Klaus, to think critically, to question authority gently, to remember that borders were inventions and humanity was not. When Klaus was conscripted in 1941, Johann wept. When Johann died at Kharkov in early 1942, Margarete stopped weeping. She became something harder, quieter, more dangerous. A woman with nothing left to lose except her conscience. The British pilot's name was Flight Sergeant Thomas Pritchard, 23 years old, from a village in Yorkshire that Margaret would never see. His Lancaster bomber had been shot down during a night raid on Cologne's industrial yards, part of Air Marshal Harris's escalating campaign to break German morale through fire. 6 of his crew died in the flames. Thomas survived only because his parachute deployed during the aircraft's death spiral, depositing him into German farmland like some reverse miracle, traded from the sky's judgment to the earth's mercy. When Margarete found him in her barn on March 14th, he was unconscious, his left leg shattered, his flight suit soaked with blood and hydraulic fluid. She could have called the authorities. The Gestapo offered rewards for captured Allied airmen. Her neighbors would have understood. Instead, she dragged him into her cellar, using strength she didn't know a widow possessed. She cleaned his wounds with schnapps and bandaged them with torn bedsheets. She gave him water first, always water first, because thirst is the cruelest teacher. Then bread, then soup made from potatoes and the last of her hoarded chicken stock. She did not ask herself why. She simply did what her vanished husband would have wanted, what her absent son would have needed if positions were reversed. 3 days passed in whispered conversations and shared silence, in the strange intimacy of captor and captive who discover they are neither. But in a village of 300 souls, secrets have the half-life of morning frost. Someone had seen the parachute's descent. Someone had noticed Margaret's doubled food purchases despite living alone. Someone, perhaps out of duty, perhaps fear, perhaps the petty malice that tyranny cultivates like a crop, had reported her to the Ortsgruppenleiter, the local Nazi party leader. In the machinery of totalitarian control, such reports move with bureaucratic efficiency. The Ortsgruppenleiter informed the Gestapo. The Gestapo contacted the SS. Now, on the morning of March the 17th, that machinery arrives in Krefeld with the cold precision of German engineering. 3 vehicles, 2 trucks carrying SS troops from the 12th Security Regiment, and 1 black Mercedes bearing Sturmbannführer Heinrich Vogel, a career officer whose specialty is rooting out defeatism and racial treachery in the Reich's increasingly restive population. Vogel is 45, a veteran of the Polish campaign, a man who believes in order above all things. He has sent 200 people to concentration camps. He sleeps soundly. The convoy stops outside Margaret's farmhouse at 7:47 a.m. 16 soldiers dismount with practiced efficiency, their weapons ready, their faces showing neither anger nor sympathy, only the blank professionalism of men performing routine extermination. They surround the property in a textbook encirclement pattern. Vogel steps from his Mercedes, adjusting his gloves, his breath visible in the March cold. He carries a leather folder containing Margaret's file, her husband's death certificate, her son's last known posting, missing, presumed dead, Stalingrad, her former teaching position, dismissed 1939, insufficient enthusiasm for National Socialist education reforms, and the anonymous denunciation filed 2 days prior. Inside the cellar, Thomas Pritchard hears the commotion. His German is minimal, a few words learned from propaganda leaflets, but he understands the tone of voices that have come to kill. He looks at Margaret, this woman who saved him for reasons he still doesn't fully comprehend, and sees in her face something he's only read about in poetry, grace under impossible circumstances. She does not cry. She does not rage. She simply places her hand on his shoulder and says, in halting English, learned from her banned books, "I am sorry. I tried." Above them, heavy boots cross the threshold. A voice shouts for Margaret Hoffman to present herself immediately. The cellar door, hidden beneath a worn rug, will not stay hidden long. They have dogs. They have time. They have the absolute certainty of power. Margaret ascends from the cellar with the dignity of someone who has already made peace with consequence. She closes the door carefully behind her, not hiding, for there is no hiding now, but delaying, granting Thomas Pritchard perhaps 5 more minutes of life. She climbs the wooden stairs into her kitchen, where 4 SS soldiers stand with rifles raised, their young faces hard beneath their helmets. In the doorway stands Sturmbannführer Vogel, his uniform immaculate, his eyes conducting a rapid inventory of her modest home. "Frau Hoffmann," he says, his voice neither loud nor soft, simply factual. "You are accused of harboring an enemy combatant. You understand this is treason punishable by death." "I understand," she replies, and her steadiness surprises even herself. She had expected fear to overwhelm her at this moment. Instead, she feels something closer to relief. The waiting is over. The choice has been made. Whatever comes next is merely consequence, and consequence at least has the virtue of certainty. Vogel studies her with the clinical interest of an entomologist examining a specimen. He has encountered defiance before, hysterical defiance, righteous defiance, stupid defiance born of ignorance. But this woman's calm unsettles him in ways he cannot immediately articulate. She is not theatrical. She is not trying to justify herself. She simply stands in her kitchen, her hands folded, waiting. "Where is the pilot?" he asks. "In the cellar." No hesitation, no attempt at deception. Vogel gestures to his men, who move immediately to search. Within 90 seconds, they've found the hidden door, dragged Thomas Pritchard up into the daylight. He cannot stand on his shattered leg, so they prop him against the kitchen wall, his face gray with pain and shock. He looks at Margaret. She looks back. No words pass between them, but Vogel, watching, sees something in that exchange that enrages him more than the treachery itself. Complicity, understanding, the kind of human connection that his ideology insists cannot exist across the lines of race and nation. "You gave him food," Vogel says, reading from his folder. "Water, medical attention. You concealed him from authorities. You, a German woman, a war widow, chose to aid the enemy who bombs our cities, who kills our children, who seeks to destroy our civilization. I gave a dying boy water," Margaret corrects quietly. "That is what I did." The simplicity of her statement hangs in the kitchen like smoke. Vogel's jaw tightens. Truth delivered without embellishment is always the most dangerous propaganda. Vogel orders both prisoners restrained. Thomas is handcuffed despite his inability to flee. Margaret's hands are bound with practiced efficiency, the rope cutting into her wrists. The SS soldiers work with mechanical precision, their faces betraying nothing. They have done this countless times before, in Poland, in France, in occupied Russia, in Germany itself, where the war's demands have transformed citizen oversight into a network of mutual suspicion that would make the Stasi envious. Outside, villagers begin to gather. Not close, no one approaches an SS operation, but near enough to witness. Frau Kessler from the bakery, Herr Dietrich who manages the coal depot, the grocer, the postman, the retired carpenter. They stand in doorways and behind windows, watching as one of their own is dragged toward judgment. Some faces show shock, others show satisfaction. Most show that careful neutrality that is survival's first language under dictatorship. They are thinking, better her than me. They are thinking she knew the rules. They are thinking, what else could she expect? But a few, a very few, are thinking something more dangerous. They remember Margaret Hoffman before the war, when she taught their children to read, when she organized Christmas concerts, when she sat with dying old women and read them poetry. They remember her husband Johann, his gentleness, his violin music drifting through summer evenings. They remember that Klaus Hoffmann, her son, once shared his lunch with a Jewish classmate and was beaten by Hitler Youth for it. They remember that not everyone who wears the label German has forgotten what that word meant before it was poisoned. Inside the house, Vogel makes a decision that will define what happens next. He could execute them both immediately. Summary execution is within his authority for cases of treason. He could transport them to regional Gestapo headquarters in Dusseldorf for interrogation and show trial. Or he could do something more calculated. Make an example. In the 6th year of total war, with defeats mounting in the east and Allied bombers darkening German skies nightly, the Reich's domestic security apparatus understands that terror must be visible to be effective. Bring them outside, Vogel orders. Assemble the village, everyone. Use the church bell. I want every citizen of Krefeld to see what happens to traitors. The soldiers move to comply. Margaret and Thomas are hauled toward the door. The morning sun, weak through clouds, falls across them both. The last light they may ever see is free consciousness. The church bell rings, not the measured tolling that calls the faithful to prayer, but the urgent clanging that signals emergency. In a German village in 1943, that sound can mean only a few things: air raid, fire, or SS assembly. The villagers emerge from their homes slowly, reluctantly, knowing that what they are about to witness will require them to choose: complicity through silence, or resistance that may cost them everything. They gather in the square before Margaret's farmhouse. 300 people, give or take, representing the demographic collapse of a nation that has fed its young men into the furnaces of total war. The crowd is disproportionately old, female, and young, children held close to mothers' skirts, grandmothers leaning on canes, a handful of men either too old for service or returned from the Eastern Front bearing wounds that disqualified them from further sacrifice. One such veteran, a former schoolteacher named Ernst Weber, stands at the crowd's edge. He is missing his right arm below the elbow, lost at Sevastopol. He taught history before the war. Now he teaches nothing, because history itself has become a dangerous subject. Vogel positions himself on Margaret's front steps like a prosecutor before a jury. His soldiers form a cordon around the two prisoners, who kneel in the dirt. Margaret with silent dignity, Thomas barely conscious from pain and shock. The Sturmbannführer allows the silence to build, understanding that anticipation is fear's most useful tool. Then he speaks, his voice carrying across the assembly with the trained projection of a man accustomed to addressing masses. Citizens of Krefeld, you have been summoned to witness justice. This woman, he gestures toward Margarete, has committed high treason against the Reich. She has sheltered an enemy combatant. She has given aid to a terrorist who participated in the indiscriminate bombing of German civilians. She has chosen the enemy over her own people, over the memory of her husband who died defending our nation, over the future of German children. He pauses, letting his words settle. Some villagers nod, others stare at the ground. In the back of the crowd, Ernst Weber clenches his remaining fist until his knuckles whiten. The penalty for such betrayal is death, Vogel continues. But before sentence is carried out, I will allow the traitor to speak. Perhaps she wishes to beg forgiveness. Perhaps she wishes to confess her full collaboration. Perhaps she wishes to name others who share her disease. He looks down at Margarete. Speak, Frau Hoffmann. Explain yourself to your neighbors. Margarete rises to her feet with difficulty, her bound hands making balance precarious. She looks at the assembled villagers, people she has known for 20 years, people whose children she taught, people with whom she has shared bread and grief and the small joys that survive even in darkness. She sees Frau Kessler, who once wept in her kitchen when her own son was killed at Narvik. She sees Herr Dietrich, who secretly listened to BBC broadcasts and sometimes shared the news in whispers. She sees the faces of those who are already judging her, and those who are not judging at all but simply witnessing, and those few, very few, whose eyes show something that might be understanding. I have nothing to confess, she says clearly. I found a wounded boy in my barn. He was dying of thirst. I gave him water. That is not treason. That is humanity. A murmur ripples through the crowd. Vogel's expression hardens. Humanity? He repeats, his voice dripping with contempt. This terrorist's comrades burned Hamburg. They incinerated 40,000 civilians in a single night. Women, children, the elderly, burned alive in firestorms that turned city streets into rivers of melted asphalt. And you speak of humanity? Yes, Margaret says simply. Because if we abandon humanity to fight those who abandoned it, then what are we fighting for? We become exactly what we claim to oppose. My husband died believing he was defending something noble. My son disappeared believing he was protecting something worth protecting. If that something does not include mercy for the helpless, then their deaths meant nothing. The silence that follows is absolute. Vogel stares at her with something approaching disbelief. He has conducted dozens of these public trials, heard every form of excuse, denial, and breakdown. But this woman's refusal to be ashamed, her insistence on reframing treason as conscience, it threatens something more fundamental than military discipline. It threatens the entire moral architecture that allows the Reich to function. You are a fool, he says quietly, and in that quietness there is more danger than in any shout. You have condemned yourself and this enemy pilot to death. Your name will be recorded as a traitor. Your property will be confiscated. Your son, if he lives, will bear the shame of his mother's betrayal. And for what? For water given to an enemy? Yes, Margaret says. For water, for the smallest act of mercy. I would do it again. Thomas Pritchard, barely conscious, understands enough German to grasp what is happening. He tries to speak, to tell them she is innocent, but his voice emerges as a rasp lost in the wind. What happens next occurs so quickly that later, witnesses will disagree on the exact sequence. From the back of the crowd, Ernst Weber steps forward. The one-armed veteran moves with the careful deliberation of a man who has spent months learning to rebalance his body after amputation. He walks directly toward the SS cordon, and the soldiers tense, their weapons shifting toward this potential threat. But Weber stops at a respectful distance and removes his hat, a gesture of civilian deference that momentarily confuses the calculation of danger. Sturmbannführer, he says, his voice steady. I would like to speak. Vogel regards him with irritation. This is not a forum for debate, veteran. Return to your position. I wish only to provide context. Weber persists. I taught in this village for 15 years before the war. I taught history. I taught the children of these people. I taught Margaret Hoffmann's son, Klaus. He pauses. I also taught the Geneva Conventions as part of our curriculum on international law. The Reich is a signatory to those conventions. They require humane treatment of wounded combatants. Frau Hoffmann, whether she knew it or not, was acting in accordance with international law that our government ratified. It is a desperate argument, legally threadbare, but it has the quality of forcing the proceeding onto different terrain. Several villagers shift uncomfortably. They remember Weber as a good teacher, a decorated soldier. His presence complicates the narrative of simple treachery. Vogel's face hardens. The Geneva Conventions do not apply to terror bombers who target civilians. They forfeited protection when they chose to wage war against women and children. Then we have also forfeited it, Weber says quietly. Rotterdam, Warsaw, Coventry, London. Do we admit that we wage the same war? Or do we pretend that our bombs are righteous while theirs are criminal? Frau Hoffmann gave water to a wounded man. If that is treason, then every German soldier who ever showed mercy to a Russian prisoner, every sailor who pulled a drowning enemy from the sea, every medic who treated a captured partisan, all traitors. Is that the Germany we defend? The crowd's murmur intensifies. This is dangerous talk, the kind that invites immediate arrest. Vogel makes a gesture and two soldiers move toward Weber. But before they reach him, another voice rises. Frau Kessler, the baker, her face pale but determined. My son died at Narvik, she calls out. Margaret held me while I wept. For 3 days, she sat in my kitchen and helped me survive. Is that woman a traitor? Or are we simply killing anyone who remembers what kindness means? The situation is deteriorating from Vogel's perspective. What should have been a simple demonstration of power is becoming a referendum on the Reich's moral legitimacy. More voices begin to rise from the crowd. Not many, not a majority, but enough to crack the monolith of fearful compliance. Herr Dietrich mentions that his nephew, captured by the British in North Africa, was treated well in a POW camp and returned home relatively healthy. A young mother reminds everyone that Margaret helped deliver her daughter during an air raid when the midwife couldn't reach them. An elderly farmer recalls how Johann Hoffmann, Margaret's late husband, once worked for 3 days without pay to repair his barn after a storm. These testimonies are not organized resistance. They are spontaneous, fragmentary, driven more by personal loyalty than political courage. But they create something that Vogel, for all his experience with suppression, did not anticipate: a competing narrative. The Reich's power rests on controlling the story, defining who is hero and who is traitor, who deserves life and who deserves death. When that story fractures, when ordinary people begin to supply their own definitions, the machinery of totalitarian control begins to stall. Vogel makes a calculation. He can crush this dissent immediately with mass arrests, turning a single execution into a purge that will traumatize the village for generations. Such actions have been taken before in other localities, with predictable results: short-term compliance, long-term resentment, and the creation of martyrs who become more dangerous dead than alive. Alternatively, he can proceed with the execution of Margaret and Thomas, accepting the moral ambiguity as the cost of maintaining discipline, and trust that fear will reassert itself once the moment passes. He chooses the latter. Raising his hand for silence, he speaks with renewed authority. Enough. Sentiment is not law. Personal affection is not principle. This woman committed treason. The penalty stands. She and the enemy pilot will be executed immediately as examples to... No. The word comes from an unexpected source. Obergefreiter Klaus Schneider, one of the SS soldiers in Vogel's own detail. He is 24, from Munich, a committed National Socialist who has served with distinction in the East. He stands now with his rifle lowered, his face conflicted. Sir, with respect, my mother is the same age as this woman. If I were shot down over England and dying of thirst, I would hope someone would give me water. How can we condemn that? Vogel turns to face this new rebellion within his own ranks, and for the first time, uncertainty flickers across his features. The moment hangs suspended. A Sturmbannführer facing dissent not from civilians he can dismiss as weak or corrupted, but from his own soldier, a young man whose doubts reflect a deeper erosion of certainty that 6 years of total war have carved into the Wehrmacht's and SS's collective psyche. Vogel understands immediately that how he handles this challenge will determine not just the fate of 2 prisoners, but the cohesion of his unit, and perhaps his own authority. Obergefreiter Schneider, Vogel says, his voice ice. You are relieved of duty. Report to the vehicle and await disciplinary proceedings. Schneider doesn't move. Around him, the other soldiers shift uncomfortably. They are young men, most barely out of adolescence, who have been trained to obey without question. But they have also seen things in the East, things that made them question whether the cause they serve is as righteous as the propaganda insists. They have seen villages burned, prisoners shot, women raped, children starved. They have participated in some of these acts, witnessed others, heard whispered confessions in the dark from comrades whose consciences did not survive intact. And now, in a quiet German village far from the front, they are being asked to execute a middle-aged woman whose crime was kindness. Sir, another soldier speaks. Schütze Paul Werner, 19, from Berlin. Perhaps we could, that is, perhaps headquarters should make this decision. We could transport them for official trial. It is a face-saving compromise, a way for Vogel to delay execution without appearing weak. But Vogel knows that delays are dangerous. Once the momentum of terror is broken, it rarely recovers. He needs swift, visible punishment to restore the boundary between permissible and impermissible behavior. Yet he also sees the fault lines opening in his own command structure. If he orders Schneider arrested and another soldier refuses, the contagion of doubt will spread. If he pushes too hard, he might find himself facing something far worse than civilian dissent: military mutiny. Into this paralysis, Thomas Pritchard speaks. His German is broken, his voice weak from pain, but his meaning is clear. Nicht ihre Schuld, meine Schuld. Sie töten mich, nicht sie. Not her fault, my fault. Kill me, not her. The villagers hear this, an enemy pilot attempting to absolve his savior, and the moral calculus shifts again. Even those who were prepared to watch Margaret die now confront a different question. Can we watch a man sacrifice himself for a German woman and still call him a monster? Vogel realizes he has lost control of the narrative. The neat categories, traitor and patriot, enemy and German, justice and mercy, have blurred into a moral complexity that authoritarian systems cannot tolerate. He must reassert dominance immediately, or accept that his authority in this district is finished. He draws his sidearm, a Walther P-38, and points it directly at Thomas Pritchard's head. "This terrorist will die," he announces. "The question is whether Frau Hoffmann dies with him. That depends on whether this village remembers its loyalty to the fatherland, or continues to indulge in sentimental weakness that aids our enemies." He is making a bet that, confronted with immediate violence, the crowd will recoil into obedience, that the sight of death will remind them why they fear the SS, that blood will wash away ambiguity. But Ernst Weber steps forward again, positioning himself between Vogel's pistol and the prisoners. He does this calmly, with the strange fearlessness of a man who has already died once on a battlefield and finds this second death almost mundane by comparison. "Then you will have to shoot through me, Sturmbannführer. I am a decorated veteran. My brother died at Stalingrad. My father served in the Great War. If you murder me for protecting a woman whose only crime was mercy, you will have to explain to headquarters why a loyal German soldier with the Iron Cross had to be executed to kill a British pilot. That report will make interesting reading in Berlin. It is a bluff, but a calculated one." Weber knows that the SS, for all its brutality, operates within a bureaucratic framework that requires justification. Summary execution of civilians is routine. Summary execution of decorated Wehrmacht veterans creates paperwork, inquiries, political complications. Vogel hesitates, not from compassion, but from calculation. In that hesitation, Frau Kessler moves to stand beside Weber, then Herr Dietrich, then the young mother, then others, not many, perhaps 20 out of 300, but enough to form a human barrier between the SS and the prisoners. They are terrified, these ordinary Germans, their hands shaking, their faces pale. They are not heroes in any traditional sense. They are simply people who have reached the limit of what they can witness without acting, even if action means their own destruction. Vogel looks at his soldiers. Half have raised their rifles toward the human shield. Half have not. In that split, he sees the dissolution of absolute power. He can order a massacre, or he can retreat. There is no third option. The standoff endures for 17 seconds, an eternity compressed into the space between heartbeats. Vogel's finger rests on the trigger. The villagers stand motionless, expecting death. The SS soldiers wait for the order that will define them as either executioners or mutineers. And in the center of this frozen tableau, Margaret Hoffmann closes her eyes, not in fear, but in something stranger, gratitude, that these people, her neighbors, her students' parents, her friends, have chosen to risk themselves for her and for a principle larger than survival, has redeemed something she thought the war had destroyed. Then, cutting through the silence, comes a sound that changes everything. The air raid siren from Krefeld's town hall, its wail rising and falling in the distinctive pattern that means Allied bombers are approaching. It is 11:47 a.m., unusual timing, as RAF raids typically occur at night. But the Americans favor daylight precision bombing, and the 8th Air Force has been escalating its operations in recent weeks. Within seconds, the wail is joined by another sound, aircraft engines growing louder, the deep drone of heavy bombers that makes the ground vibrate and the sky seem to contract. Vogel's head snaps upward. Every soldier's head turns skyward. The villagers scatter instinctively, running for basements and shelters. Discipline dissolves into survival instinct. The Sturmbannführer lowers his weapon, shouting orders to his men to mount up and return to headquarters in Dusseldorf, where their defensive coordination is needed. The truck's engines roar to life. The SS detail begins retreating toward their vehicles in that controlled chaos that is military withdrawal under threat. In the confusion, Ernst Weber cuts Margaret's bonds with a pocket knife. Herr Dietrich helps Thomas Pritchard to his feet, or foot, as his broken leg makes walking impossible. They carry him toward Weber's basement as the first bombs begin to fall on the rail yards 2 kilometers away. The ground shakes. Windows shatter. The church bell rings wildly from concussion rather than human hands. Vogel, seated in his Mercedes, watches this dissolution of his authority with cold rage. He will file a report. He will return with more men. He will see this treason punished. But today, in this moment, he has lost. Not to enemy bombs or military defeat, but to something more fundamental, ordinary people choosing conscience over compliance. As his convoy speeds away, bombs falling behind them. He does not yet understand that this small rebellion in an insignificant village is a preview of the Reich's true ending. The bombing raid lasts 18 minutes. 12 B-17 flying fortresses from the American 306th Bombardment Group, targeting the Krefeld rail junction that supplies German forces in the west. The bombs fall with precision. The Americans have learned from early failures, refined their Norden bomb sites, improved their formation tactics. The rail yards explode in cascading detonations. Metal twists, fire spreads, the ground erupts, but the village itself is spared. The bombers stay focused on their military target, adhering to orders that attempt, imperfectly, inconsistently, to distinguish between combatants and civilians. By noon, the raid ends. The all-clear sounds. Villagers emerge from basements into a world transformed by smoke and silence. In Ernst Weber's cellar, Margaret and Thomas sit on opposite sides of a wooden table. Between them rests a cup of water, the same gesture that began this entire sequence of events. Thomas drinks slowly, his hands shaking. Margaret watches him with an expression that Weber, observing from the stairs, cannot fully interpret. It is not quite motherly affection, not quite political solidarity. Perhaps it is simply the look one human gives another when they have both survived something that should have killed them. You will have to leave, Weber tells Margaret quietly. Vogel will return. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but he will return. You cannot stay here. Margaret nods. She has been thinking the same thing. There is an underground network, she has heard whispers, that smuggles people across the border into Switzerland. Jews, deserters, dissidents, anyone marked for death by the regime. It will be dangerous. She will lose everything, her home, her identity, her country, but she will be alive, and Thomas will be alive, and that seems in this moment like enough. Why did you do it? Thomas asks in broken German. Why risk everything? Margaret considers the question. She thinks of her husband, her son, the life she built that the war destroyed. She thinks of the books she read as a girl, the philosophy she studied, the teacher she became who believed that education was ultimately about teaching people to see the humanity in others, even, especially, when ideology insisted otherwise. Because, she says finally, if I had not given you water, I would have become someone I could not live with. We do not choose the wars we are born into, but we choose, every day, whether to remain human within them. Outside, smoke rises from the bombed rail yards. Inside, 3 people sit in a cellar and contemplate the price and promise of mercy. History records that Margaret Hoffman and Flight Sergeant Thomas Pritchard both survived the war, though the records are fragmentary and the paths unclear. What is known comes from post-war testimony compiled by researchers attempting to document civilian resistance in Nazi Germany, a resistance that was never organized, never political in the conventional sense, but rather comprised of individual acts of conscience that added up over time to something that resembled moral rebellion. Margaret disappeared from Krefeld in late March 1943. The most credible accounts place her in Switzerland by May, aided by Catholic clergy operating an underground network. She worked as a translator in Geneva for the remainder of the war, lived quietly in a rented room, and wrote letters to an address in England that she somehow obtained. Letters that went unanswered until August 1945, when Thomas Pritchard returned from a POW camp after being recaptured during his own attempted escape, finally responded. They met once after the war in 1947 in a cafe in Zurich. Thomas brought his young wife. Margaret brought nothing but memories. They spoke for 3 hours, comparing their parallel survivals, acknowledging the improbability of both being alive. Thomas told her that his village in Yorkshire had been bombed by the Luftwaffe in 1940. 3 members of his family died. He did not blame her. She did not apologize. There was nothing to apologize for, he insisted. You saved me, he said. And by saving me, you proved that not every German was the enemy. That mattered. That still matters. Ernst Weber was arrested by the Gestapo in June 1943. He died in Dachau concentration camp in February 1945, 3 months before liberation. His name appears on a memorial in Krefeld carved alongside 200 other victims of Nazi terror from the region. His daughter, interviewed in 1987, said only, "My father believed that some things were worth dying for. I think he was right. I hope I never have to test whether I would have his courage." The war changed nations, toppled empires, and redrew the map of human possibility. But it also posed a simpler question to millions of individuals. When confronted with another's suffering, what will you choose? Margaret Hoffman chose mercy. It cost her everything except her soul. In the arithmetic of conscience, that is not a loss. It is the only victory that survives when everything else has burned. Some water, given in kindness, quenches more than thirst. It redeems the idea of humanity itself.